Kia ora koutou. Welcome to this Transportation Group webinar, Chairs Conversation series. I'm the chair of the Transportation Group, Bridget Burdett, coming at you live from Hamilton in the age of the webinar. This series is going on for a few months, probably, to investigate some of the disconnects that exist between the vision that we have in transport and in government and planning generally in New Zealand, and some of the talk about climate change and transport, bust some myths around renewable energy and offsetting and what we should be really aiming to do if we want to adapt to a changing world, mitigate some of the worst effects of climate change and come out the end surviving. So we'll get into that shortly. Firstly, I'll just let you know that we've had a survey going on of Transportation Group members in terms of their views on climate change, whether they think it's real and whether they think the group should do anything about it. And I'll share those results in more depth in the next roundabout newsletter, which is coming out in the middle of this month. But firstly, it was the overarching result really was that the vast majority of group members who responded, we had 170 responses, and over 80% of them agreed to every statement around climate change, including that it's an important issue to me personally. I've become more concerned about it in recent years. The group has a role in responding to climate change. The group should work with other organisations to respond, and that walking, cycling and public transport have a significant role to play in reducing emissions. And 98 point something% of the group agree that climate change is real and happening. So that's a good result, gives us a mandate to have this conversation and then to move forward into what we should be doing about it. So Mike, if you'd like to turn on your webcam, I'll hand over to you and we'll get into some of the conversation that we've got planned. We're going to talk for about half an hour and then we'll respond to any questions that come up. There's a question and answer box in the platform. Feel free to type your questions in there, and it will be, we'll try and get through as many as we can, but it will be kind of biased towards early questioners. So if you've got something you particularly want to ask us or want us to talk about, then get in early with your questions. So over to you, Mike. Would you like to introduce yourself and tell our members where you are and what you do in your life and what is interesting to you about climate change?
Okay, sure. Thanks, Bridget, and hi everyone. Yeah, I'm a senior researcher at the Institute for Governance and Policy Studies at Victoria University in Wellington. And I'm at home in Paekakariki at the moment. I'm an ecologist, started off in freshwater ecology. Actually, I started off a whole life. I didn't go to university, didn't walk into the door of a university until I was in my mid-30s, and then did a degree, a science degree in ecology, then a master's with honours in ecology, and then a PhD. All at Massey, and then started lecturing there, and shifted to Victoria a couple of years ago. And I've kind of, it seems bizarre, but energy and climate and the relationship between them, most people I don't think would connect with ecology, particularly not freshwater ecology. But really early in my studies, because I started on my master's looking at native fish and migration, what it turns out that it's all about, and what we talk about in biology as fitness, is all about energy return on investment. I was looking at migrating fish, and the crazy thing was that they migrated huge different distances, and it just seemed to make no sort of ecological sense or evolutionary sense until you started calculating energy, and you realize that the energy return on investment was about 14 to 1. Like, for every calorie of energy expended by the fish, there was a return of 14. And then you kind of expand that out, and you see that, you can imagine, animals running around in Africa, and if they expend more energy than they do from what they get from what they capture, then they'll die. And that's what we talk about as fitness. And the connection is then, and this was made by, I think the term was first coined by a physicist, but then it was a biologist that he was working with, and that was the energy return on investment. And that is so core to understanding our predicament at the moment and how we have relied on energy. We have the situation now where fossil fuel energy makes up 84% of the energy that's used on the planet by humans, and we have to get out of it. So 84% of the energy that gives us everything we need and builds everything, our roads, our cars, our everything we see around us is comes from fossil fuels, and we have to stop doing that. So we're at an incredible turning point. So that's kind of a quick roundup of how I got to be thinking and talking
Pretty
about
massive issue, yeah.
Mm.
So, and just a bit of context, you started out, you told me, as a bit of a motorhead. Like you've got, it's not like you're a anti-car fanatic from way back. You have a bit of sympathy for people who actually quite enjoy driving. Spend a bit of
Yeah,
time on
yeah.
roads, right?
Yeah. Like as a young guy, I got my first car when I was 14, and I was just in love with cars, and that's what my position in life I felt was judged by the car, and I spent all my life, my early days playing around with cars and hotting them up and all that kind of thing, and then ended up driving taxis. I was rebuilding an old sailing boat, and I drove taxis in my 20s for 4 years, and then drove buses later on, and trucks. I was, on the early days of long distance truck and trailer stuff in New Zealand around the 80s. I was involved in that as well. So yeah, I'm very much. It's a big turnaround for me to kind of realize, I still am at heart a bit of a motorhead, but realize the reality of it now.
Well, there's hope for us all then, isn't there, I guess. So talking about energy and transport
Mm.
and climate change, is the question then one just of switching to renewable energy? Is that something that we should be pursuing, or is there some problems with that make it a bit of a fallacy that if we just switch to renewable electricity and plug in our electric cars, then we'll all be fine?
Yeah, well, it's really important to think about energy. It's not just electricity. In fact, it's a small part of it. If we actually counted properly, we'd find that only about 20% of our total energy use is electricity. The other 80% is from fossil fuels. So for a start, that's kind of a big problem for us, because we feel kind of virtuous that 80% of our electricity comes from renewable, and I want to put those kind of quote things around renewable. What we actually mean is replaceable, and there are some really big issues around. So the 84% of all of our energy use globally that has to be replaced, which is fossil fuels at the moment, and we have to stop doing that. We've got sort of 10 years worth of oil available, or fossil fuels available at our current use. The trouble is that all of these so-called renewables require huge amounts of fossil fuels to mine the materials, to transport the materials, to build the infrastructure. And the energy, there's kind of two things going on with that fossil fuel energy as well. The energy return on investment of fossil fuels is declining rapidly. So beginning of last century, when we first discovered it, it squirted up out of the ground, and it was 100 to 1 or something like that. 1 barrel of oil to get 100. A bit more, cost refining and all that, and transporting it costs, some of that energy as well. But now globally, it's about 15. And so we start getting into that. We've taken all the easy stuff. We're getting into the hard stuff. So we've got that decline in the energy return on investment of the fossil fuels that we need to create the so-called renewables. And the other thing that kind of goes hand in hand with that is that the materials that we're mining, copper is a really good example. Almost everything we do with electricity requires copper, whether it's the wind turbines, the solar panels, connecting them all up, the grid, the infrastructure, the cars. And copper's getting rarer and rarer, and now we have to turn over 100 times more material. We have to mine 100 times more material to get that copper than we did 100 years ago. So these two things are working like a double positive feedback loop, just making it impossible to be able to to maintain the lifestyles that we have and the energy use we have with renewables is impossible for a number of reasons. One, and there's a great report, I guess you're going to have links to these things somewhere, but this great
Yep.
report that's just been done by Simon Michaud and others, but they've looked at, if we want to convert to renewable, how much material will be required, how much do we know of, and it's just an impossible situation to try and find the materials to do it, plus the huge amount of fossil fuels that will be required to mine and do all the things to set it up as well. So it just isn't going to happen. And if we try to, this thing that scares me the most is that we won't admit that, and we'll just carry on pretending that we're going to be able, thinking that we're going to be able to do it, and the harm that will be done to the life supporting capacity of the planet as we mine the hell out of it and punch out all the fossil fuels, the carbon dioxide from the fossil fuels to dig up this stuff, will mean that it actually shortens our opportunities, or it reduces our opportunities to live long term on the planet.
Just keeps making that graph steeper and steeper, and the shift more and more dramatic.
Yeah.
Is there a problem related to that with the way that we account for emissions? Like New Zealand draws a ring fence around itself, and once the carbon is in the country, where it comes from is not really included in our calculations. So as long as what we're putting out there is renewable, then we don't properly account for embedded emissions and for the impact on the rest of the world. I can just imagine there's kind of this increasing inequality where there are a lot of communities where the mining happens and the destruction is really obvious, and they're just fueling the wealthy lifestyles of us. La 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 la. Is there a bit of that going on in the world?
Oh, for sure. I mean, I just
like clever accounting,
if we close down the refinery at Marsden Point, then 80% of our emissions will drop, because that number might be wrong, but a huge chunk of our emissions will go offshore to Indonesia. We'll just use just as much, but that accounting or some stuff that I was involved in recently for Wellington City Council looking at carbon zero. I mean, I came up with the solution straight away. All they needed to do to get rid of all of their transport emissions was just to shift all the service stations outside of the city boundaries. Quite easy with Wellington, because it's just chuck them all in Lower Hutt on the motorway just over the boundary, or in Poirua, and you've got rid of all your emissions. That's the sort of crazy game that we play, where we kid ourselves that we are, because the emissions stay with the place that they came from, not with the product. That's where we completely trick ourselves. And
not only that, but the calculations you're talking about are based on kind of the current population and levels of consumption, but the world is trying to get wealthier and trying to grow its domestic product, and populations are growing as well. So, it's another an inconvenient feedback loop, right? Like, it's just making that reduction that we need harder and harder again if we are relying on the delusion of renewables or some kind of technology to save the day.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, it's just we've got 85 million people being added to the planet every year, and of course the energy use required for that just keeps going up and up and up. So, that's a dilemma that we have to talk about, and that's the fact that the impossibility of growth, of us being able to continue growing.
Cool. So continuing on our gloom and doom thread, what about carbon offsetting? Can I just take my keep cup on my Air New Zealand flight and be nice and smug that I've paid my $3.50 and someone's going to plant a tree somewhere, happy days? Or is there some kind of problem with offsetting?
Yeah, there's a huge problem with it, and that is that it's kind of hard to say it simply, but you could replant. So what you're doing when you offset your flight or whatever is you plant some trees, and there's a whole lot of issues around that. But the biggest one I want everyone to think about is the fact that we could replant every tree on the planet, and every single one in all the wetlands and all that kind of stuff. If we replaced everything that we've removed, we haven't accounted for a single kilogram of fossil carbon. So we plant up the whole planet. All we do is mitigate what we chop down, and then because the carbon that we're releasing in fossil fuels was basically laid down over about 200 million years, ending about 65 million years ago. So that's thousands and millions of carbon cycles that carbon was captured and laid down. So we're releasing carbon from the past and kidding ourselves that we can mitigate it with carbon sequestration in the current cycle. So, it's carbon you're sequestering, but you're not addressing the issue. You're addressing a side issue kind of thing.
Do you think that's part of the systemic, public conversation problem, that it feels so good to plant a tree or to drive your hybrid or whatever? Those things aren't inherently evil, but they're a distraction from just the level of change that's needed, because we've been so, in terms of the life of the planet, we have so rapidly depleted all of that carbon from the ground. We are just getting this steeper and steeper rate of change that we need now. But let's talk a bit about that politics, and because I think that comes into the whole electric car question, that people will say, oh, well, we can subsidise electric cars and promote their use while we are doing other things like encouraging people to live locally and walk and cycle. But is there a problem in perpetuating the delusion in itself that we have electric cars, therefore we keep building more road lanes, and they're built from not nice things, and there's tyres and waste and just ongoing expanse? Like, how do we communicate that to the public, or when it's not as black and white as a ute? So we're saying an electric car isn't a good idea for these complex reasons. What kind of conversations have you heard around that?
Oh, I mean, I've been majorly attacked, by the EV lovers, because, it is it is better for the atmosphere if but it's like it's deluding yourself. You jump in your electric car, and because there are no emissions at the tailpipe, then you forget all the emissions that went into building the car, to mining the material for the battery for the car, the fact that it was built overseas and it was shipped over here. So it's purely human that we don't think about the costs. It's natural that we don't think about what went into what we're doing. So we kid ourselves. And so sure, they're a great choice. They're cheap. If you can afford one, they're cheap to run. There is no emissions out of the tailpipe of it. But you are then you still need to have the roads to drive around on. The roads still need maintenance. They're still built out of fossil fuels. The roads need fossil fuels to build. The shipping and everything that went into that was fossil fuels. So and the idea that less harm, so it does less harm, that's debatable. Depends how many kilometers you do, whether it's less harm than an internal combustion engine. The question is not EVs or internal combustion. It's cars or no cars. And the reality is that cars are just not going to be possible, at least not 1 ton of steel or more of battery, roaring around on the road. It's just kidding ourselves that we can keep doing that in the future, and the impossibility of replacing the number of cars that we have on the road in the world with electric cars is just actually impossible. But then it's impossible because of all the emissions as well.
What do you think's actually going to happen then? What do you think's the world's going to be like in 20 years' time or 50 years' time? I haven't asked you this before. I'm just curious now, because we say we can't do these things.
Yeah. Well, there's plenty of predictions about it.
Because I just suspect that, we're going to have some kind of increasing apocalyptic, war-ravaged, corrupt, fighty, unpleasant world. And some deluded people might be carrying on in some island where the climate happens to suit their lifestyle, and the rest of the people just get increasingly worse off, and products that rely on those materials become harder to get and more expensive. Do you think it's going to be a forced transition then, that will just have, that's what that latest reports?
Yeah, well, that's what the IPCC is showing really well, and that's so conservative. Read a guy called Nafez Ahmed. He's written a book about this. It's just in the last couple of years. about civilization and its future. And yeah, he predicts, lots of fighting and wars and that kind of thing. So I don't think it's inevitable. I think, well, we can manage our way out of this. We can do it if we can get organized. I mean, I suspect, like you do, that we'll blindly carry on, but it's not impossible to drastically change how we live. I've just been looking at some figures for road transport in New Zealand, and a huge amount of it is shifting oil and petroleum around the country. We import 80% of our food that we eat is imported. I mean, this we export massive amounts of food. We've just turned it into energy, which is what food is. We export a huge amount of it as milk powder, and where it goes into junk food mostly. And we import, and looking at the figures, and it doesn't break it down, but a heap of it comes from Asia, and it might be from other countries and just shipped through Asia. This is just the data that I've got from import through our ports in New Zealand. So all of that then comes in and then has to go on the road and be shifted around the country. So, from it's kind of getting away from your original question about the global, but to the local.
That's relevant. Yeah, I know what you mean though. Yeah.
Of the requirement for transport in this country, if we just ate what we grew here, other than growing stuff.
Well, and we might have to eventually,
Crazy. Yeah, no,
that might be it. That might be a shift that happens. Yeah, because ultimately we'll live the dream.
But here's something we could do right now. It's just say, right, we're only going to eat local food. I mean, everyone can do that, and we could have government policy to make sure, because we could feed New Zealand on a tiny proportion of the land that we have at the moment. And if we grew local and ate local, then it'd be way less, need for roads and vehicles on the road to transport this rubbish up and down. When I was driving trucks, it was the end of regulation of milk, and I used to drive a truck and trailer full of milk from a factory in Wellington to Auckland, and I'd wave at the guys around Taupō who were doing the same thing in the other direction, bringing milk from Auckland or Hamilton down to Wellington, because there was a war on between the two dairy companies. And
gosh,
we were just, it was just idiotic, and just around here, I drive over the Rimataka Hill, and you've got log trucks going both ways. You've got trucks covered in logs going both ways over the hill. What? It's just nuts. And if you looked at all the stuff that was shifting around the oceans, it's similar. Exporting water and importing water, and
I've always thought it's ridiculous that I live here in Hamilton, in the middle of the Waikato, and I pay $12 for a kilo of cheese. Surely,
exactly,
and maybe if the true costs were assigned to things. So we talk about that in transport, and there's an increasing impetus to shift to road pricing, to charge people more, not the true cost, not anywhere near that amount, but to have congestion cordons and things that actually make more of those costs explicit to drivers, so that they are paying for it. And perhaps if we did that for cars as well, and charged people, a more realistic price to own and operate a vehicle, then the difference between electric and ICE would fade away into the background, wouldn't it? Because their actual impacts are so dramatic in terms of the road space and maintenance, as you say, and everything else.
Yeah, if the carbon price was loaded onto the and the cost of harm done in creating the car was loaded onto it, so that true cost of that car, then most people would not be able to afford one at all, not a hope in hell, if they were paying the true costs of it. So, we'd get rid of the car problem pretty quickly that way.
Or we'd just have a larger equity problem, because there's that lens to this whole conversation as well, isn't there? That we don't want to worsen inequity through, punitive methods, given that we do currently live in car-centric places. So the shifts need to be happening in parallel. So that brings me to kind of the last thing I want to talk with you about is, as a transportation group, we can try and lobby for change at a national level. We can work on projects and tools and procedures within our sector and regionally. But what can we do at a really local level if we want to make sure that the communities we live in are well set up for the coming decades, where living local is going to be forced upon us if not chosen? What do you think are some grassroots kind of initiatives that are useful?
Well, I just wanted to touch on that equity thing, because it's such a worry to me that we get that equity is a inequity is a huge issue, but it's a separate issue. So what worries me is that we won't do the things we need to do around climate, because it will impact harder on poorer people. There's no doubt about that. It always does with these kind of things. But so if we just do nothing because we try to because it's going to be inequitable, then we will be all worse off, and will harm all of us in the end. So we have to fix the inequity issue separately, and make sure that we do have alternative forms of transport. And I think we touched on it, but this crazy way that the poorest people are the ones that are most dependent on vehicles, on cars, because they have to work the kind of hours and in the kind of places that there is no public transport available, and all that kind of thing, and multiple jobs and all that kind of stuff. And the well-off like me can just sit at home and take the train to town when I need to, and all that kind of thing, and feel virtuous.
Yeah, smug e-bike riders like us. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, and I don't want to be that smug person, because I know, and have friends who are in the other situation where the car is utterly dependent on it, and so we need to sort that kind of thing out. We can't leave it, but it has to be.
So local action then, like Paikokariki.
Yeah.
Is it all about, I like talking about cross-sector stuff. So, at a local community level, if we have community markets and gardens and kohangareo, and is that part of the answer, is living more locally, and therefore going out of our comfort zone in terms of just living within the transport sector, and looking to do grassroots initiatives where transport and food production and housing and all sorts of other people come together? Is that, do you think, one thing we could do?
Yeah, and that's where we could really, I mean, it is happening and it does happen, but we could really help that along by putting the true cost on things. If the true cost was going on those imported goods and vehicles and all that kind of stuff, then it would make so much more sense to do everything at a local scale. And it's partly market driven as well. We have to change that idea that the market knows best and kind of open everything up. I just see in this little town here, we have 3 different companies that come, competing for rubbish pickups here. So you have 3 different rubbish trucks driving around this place picking up rubbish bins, because they're all competing with each other. The local.
Is it private? Like, how does your rubbish collection work? Is it not run by the council?
It's private. So the council just handed
it's a special Paikokariki thing.
Well, no, I don't know. I think it's all around here. Everybody just waste care and those kind of things do it, and councils have stopped doing that stuff. I don't know if they still do it in Rolla, but they don't do it here. They haven't for a long time.
Right. So local action. There's bit of a movement in transition.
Yeah.
There's movements in like transition engineering, and some of us attended a webinar by Susan Krumdijk, who's leading. She's got a degree in transition engineering and really quite. Really good leader in that space, and saying that transition engineers are the ones who have a lot of power in this system to try and change, because we're the ones designing stuff. But a lot of us will say, well, we'd like to design better things, but we design what, as consultants, what our clients tell us to do. And then the council staff will say, oh, we're only doing what the elected members tell us to do. And the elected members are only doing what will get them voted next time. So you end up with the transport sector acting at the whim of the people who vote or the people who are perceived to vote. So when you say things like we need to put the actual price on things, or we need to act local, like, what's going to trigger that? Like, who can march up to Parliament and say, look, we've got to put the true price on driving a car, and that's, is it something about, are we going to have to change democracy? Like, I always end up with debates with my colleagues saying, well, we can't do that because democracy. Like, what's actually going to you know, is it going to be a couple of 1,000-year storms in succession or something where we're like, okay, we have to actually throw out the book and build our society up again? Like, is it something that drastic?
Yeah. Well, I mean, look at COVID though. Look at this response. Look at this. What's happening right now? We
Yep.
can do it. You know, for some reason, it has to be immediate for us to get it though. You know, like I mean,
You need people on
I felt
ventilators. Yeah.
frustrated.
Yeah.
Well, that's right. I mean, you know, I've been so kind of frustrated that for however many decades I've been banging on about fresh water and the need to do something, and then, you know, and get to the point where we had 80% of New Zealanders saying that fresh water was their most important environmental issue. You know, this is going into the election
Yeah.
a couple of cycles ago. The Labor Party pretty much got in on that, you know, environmental water side of things, and then, you know, but then we don't get listened to. It's like, well, I end up on a science technical advisory group and working with Ministry for the Environment and all that kind of thing, and our thinking just got kind of sidelined. And I've actually had the opportunity to stand with Jacinda, having a beer with her and say, look, why is it with COVID you can do something and you didn't do something with us? And it's about immediacy, and it's about the strength of the opposition to it. So
Is that what she said specifically? Did she,
yeah, she
like, what did
said,
she actually say?
well, she said that, you know, when it comes to the freshwater stuff, and I say, well, why didn't you adopt what the Science Technical Advisory Group, you set us up and then you didn't listen to us? And
Yeah.
she said, but I get these calls from farmers every other day saying if they don't, you know, they're
Did she
going
say
to
that?
lose
Oh,
their
wow,
business and all
Jacinda.
that kind of thing. And so, yeah, I mean,
Let me
they
down.
are influenced by that, you know. So,
Wow.
yeah, and so, I mean, with COVID, yeah, it's real and it's in our faces and it's killing people. So we do react, and so maybe like you say, it's those extremes. I mean, man, we're seeing them more. Look at Auckland just the other day. That's
Exactly.
hopefully. Well, it's so sad. It's sad that we have to wait till it starts killing people before we do something. But
But
maybe
it's
that's what
also,
it's about.
I can almost see the extremes becoming a little bit normal. Like last year, I've got relatives in
Yeah,
Ashburton, and one of my aunties was in
yeah,
the evacuation zone, and the other one wasn't, and it's almost felt a bit like lockdown again. Oh well, they're, you
mm,
know, they're going to evacuate. What else is on the news? Like, I think humans are
yeah,
so
yeah,
adaptable. It's really unfortunate in a way that we
yeah,
don't see these things as something, a trigger to change the way we live. We're just so kind of
mm,
protective of our lifestyle and
mm,
our habits, and not having to make a change. We'll have to wait kind of for it to be forced upon us. But at least try and you know, end on something that we can do tangibly before we go to some
yeah,
questions. Starting local and grassroots stuff. If not in New Zealand, then where? You know, we can have grassroots groups of professionals and community working together to trial and pilot and see what happens, and use those as a model that other people could follow and run with.
yeah, yeah. And I think it's connecting up communities that are already doing these kind of things and learning from each other and being inspired by each other on how you can do better and you can do it right. So and that's kind of interestingly the conclusion that the group that I was working with Wellington City Council and the Better Futures Forum that I was involved in. So a couple of completely separate groups have come up with the same kind of conclusion, that it's connecting up what's already happening at grassroots. There's, you know, changes only ever come, as far as I can tell, from the bottom up, never from the top down. And so it's driven from community level and from people taking action themselves, and but connecting that up using the power of the internet and that kind of thing that we have at the moment. And there are models available that can do that. So yeah, I think that's a good place to start.
Yeah, grassroots. That sounds good. Um,
Mm,
we'll go to some of the questions, and if people have other questions or comments, feel free to put them in. There's just a couple of comments here that kind of endorsing what you say, Mike, that um,
mm,
the myth of renewables is the elephant in the room. Completely agree. Um, way less than 20% of what needs to be happening is actually happening. Hydrogen, we're not even going to talk about hydrogen. Very
mm.
unlikely, you know, in our
Yeah,
lifetime.
yeah,
Electric cars, autonomous cars, and any kind of car are not the solution. The problem is the need we have given ourselves to use cars. That's what you say, Mike. We need to make having a car pointless, and
Yes.
you know, from kind of both sides, top down, and kind of bottom, make life so easy locally that having a, why would you start it up and take it out of the garage? The sooner we change the need to use a car, the sooner we start reducing our consumption. And maybe that's part of the response to the equity challenge as well, that we go in and work with the communities who are so reliant on vehicles and talk to them about, you know, what they would need. And because I'm sure that if you're a low-income person, then spending petrol on a crappy car that's probably churning through more than you'd like to pay on it and needs more maintenance, you know, there's got to be better options, right? Like, that's what I mean about there's still a role for professionals to go in and help the communities to come up with those grassroots solutions.
It's really interesting because I've been working with Susan, you know, at multiple different functions and things we've been involved in. But what really struck me was, and as you know, because I previously got into lots of disagreements with engineers when it comes to, you know, the freshwater stuff.
Me too.
Frustrating with engineers that God, you know, you've got to understand some ecology here. But it was just so amazing that I watched one of Susan's presentations online about biophysical limits to growth, and you know, from an engineering point of view. And I'm an ecologist, and our talks were so similar. They're completely independently. We had been giving the same talks to different groups, but so similar. There's an ecologist and an engineer who just so much in common on what we were talking about that really surprised me, and it's kind of made me think that there isn't such a gap as what I thought there was between
just energy return on investment, right? Yeah. Just energy in, energy out. Yeah. There's a question. Can we please post the name of the chap Mike was talking about, the book? Okay, we'll send quite a few links out with.
Yeah, I can. I was just going to grab it off my bookshelf.
We'll send it out.
Yeah. Oh no, it's not the one. I have got it here somewhere. But...
We'll send the link out to people.
Yeah.
We've got a question. Are there existing frameworks we could extend that effectively educate, communicate, and regulate unsustainable lifestyle costs like driving cars? I'm thinking something like applying the Energy Star rating to mobility, where a fossil-fueled car would be 0 stars, an electric car 2 stars, and an electric cargo bike 12 stars, or something like that. I mean, we could chuck all the cars in the bin and just give stars to bikes. But is there some framework that you know of, or?
Well, there is this framework about, and it's been proposed often, you know, there's a couple of things I'm thinking about here, but one is, you know, like I touched on about having the emissions loaded onto the product and not the country. And that is a really, really good way of putting the true cost onto things. And so, but that means a global change, you know, because it's like we do at the moment where
exactly.
The emissions for flying within New Zealand are loaded on New Zealand. The emissions for flying to the UK go into magic, you know, pretendy places, because we just don't get loaded on any country. We just pretend it's not happening. Wow. And military emissions. Are people aware that we do not count? Military emissions are not included in our greenhouse gas accounting, because nobody wants to. They say it's kind of an issue.
Nobody wants to be in charge of that spreadsheet.
well, no, but yeah, I mean, it's massive. It's massive, and the excuse that they use is a bit like IP, and that you could figure out, you know, how big an army was by their emissions or something like that. So they don't. That's their excuse for not doing it. But that's typical of the delusion, the self-delusion that humans do, that we pretend that stuff like that's not happening. So the other thing,
and all it's evidence of the corruption and.
Yeah, possibly, but. The other idea is this idea of that we all have a carbon quota, a yearly carbon quota, and it could be like a credit card kind of thing, and you start off the year with your credit. There's an economist, Steve Keen, who's keen on this, but he kind of does it on a country base. So you just work out how many, how much you can emit per capita, and you assign that to everybody, and if you don't use it, then you've got a credit that you can sell to other people. So this is a kind of a market model for it. But I would say that we need to do it at a global scale and share it out, and evenly among the 8.9 billion people, which would mean that if you lived in Bangladesh, you would be well in credit, and if you lived in New Zealand, you would have a huge debit. You wouldn't be able to do anything at all because you'd be so far in debit, in debt. Sorry, when you started off. So but that's all these things are just ways of putting the true cost on. And which I like, because the equity comes in then,
the true equity, right, in a global sense. Yeah, so we've had another comment that if we charge people, the rich-poor divide will widen, and we're saying that may be true, but if we don't charge people, there won't be any rich or poor people left to argue about it.
No, that's right. Yes, so yes, I agree, but it's a different issue. Yes, we need to fix the rich-poor thing and the climate thing.
Yep. So someone's asked a question about hydrogen or biofuel. Are they? Is there anything in those, or does that just go back to what you were saying about renewables and alternatives? Actually, the problem is consumption and moving around, with big hunks of machinery more than we need to, probably.
Yeah, so I mean, hydrogen is just such a big have. Hydrogen is not an energy; it's just a transfer mechanism, and so it's been overhyped to hell. And Susan talks about that a lot in her work.
She does.
But there's a fantastic new report that's just come out too that we can share the link to that on this, and this idea
debunks that.
See, green hydrogen is another classic one of our self delusions, and so people go, well, so you can use renewable energy to create hydrogen, right? And they call it green like it's magic, but they haven't included any of the costs of the green infrastructure to build it. So all of the copper, all of the wind turbines, all of the concrete, all of the mining that went into the to the engines and the generators and everything. You load that onto it, and it ain't green anymore. It's black. You might as well just.
It's vomit brown.
Well, yeah, we'll make it straight out of fossil fuels. Cut out the middleman, because that's all you're doing in that process, But it's stick green in front of it, and people go, "Wow, that's the solution," So, and
delusion is kind of a thing.
Yeah, I was going to say for the the biofuels and all that kind of thing. Yeah, sure, you can do it, but again, if you if you do the energy return on investment of say crop-based corn or corn biofuels, which is what they use a lot in the States, then it's a negative energy return on investment. By the time you take into account, the energy that the fossil fuels and the energy that went into the crops and the processing and the transporting and the refining and all of that kind of stuff, you would have been better off just burning the oil in the first place, because you're actually going negative by the time you go through all of that process.
They've got a couple of questions around, are there any good examples or case studies from overseas? Do you think that they would be useful for a professional group like us? If we could draw on an example, even if it's a little community in the Netherlands or somewhere enlightened that have started doing something really well, can you think of any examples like that, or any countries that are starting to put the true price on things, at any level of the system? Have you got, are there some good stories out there? Or
yeah, Steve Keen's stuff. And you can easily find him online, and he's talking about that idea of tradable sort of carbon quota for everybody to work on. I don't know.
But he's not actually done it. It's just an idea.
No, it's an idea, and it has been talked about quite a bit, and quite a few people have seen it and have discussed it. I mean, I kind of work with a bunch of economists, and they're always kind of knocking these things and saying they won't work, but I mean, there's so many different ways of doing this, but the problem is, of course, that it's a global problem, and so getting the globe all the countries in the world to agree on anything is like, good luck. That's
but we could at a local level, we could we could just kind of cut to the chase and say, okay, in my community here, I live in Queenwood in Hamilton, could I not form a community professional collaboration with the community house, starting with community garden, and making local participation easier, trying to tackle some of
Mm.
those problems at our local level. What do we have here? What have we found in COVID that's easy to access, not easy to access? How do we get more of the hard stuff, make it easier? Who is having trouble right now participating locally? How can we help them? And then write that up as its own story. Like, nothing's stopping us, right?
No, no, and there are, I mean, you will find people that have started on those kind of things and done them. So yeah, I think that can be done. It's just it's keeping that energy going. We see how everybody wants to
Yeah, even
return to
saying that, I'm
normal
like,
and
yeah,
it's
but I'm
not.
tired.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you get tired thinking about it because the reality is that the new world, the way we have to live, there's going to be a lot more effort. I mean, this is the other way we could have talked about this, and it's another thing that you can look at. Is energy slaves. Just every single one of us, especially the ones that are on this thing today, we all have at least 200 full-time human equivalent energy slaves doing stuff for us. Way more than any of the richest people in history ever had, was because our slaves don't have to be fed and housed and watered and all that kind of thing. These energy slaves just do stuff for us constantly all the time, and we take them for granted. And so getting
Yeah.
rid of that energy subsidy in our lives is going to mean more work, and no human wants more work. We're all intrinsically lazy, right? And
Yep.
that's the kind of reality of that's why it's a hard sell politically, because people are sort of inherently don't want to do more stuff. They want to do less stuff and put their feet up. So it's going to be harder to there's
So,
no,
so
it's not
that
like
could
you
be a bit
can
of a theme.
sell something. Yeah.
When we're trying to make having a car pointless, we want that to be because the other options are inherently easier. Like, it's not that we're trying to appeal to people's conscience or whatever, but we need
Mm.
to treat it like a human factors psychology problem and say, make the good option the easy option, and then it's not a
Yeah.
question of effort. It's flipped in favour of doing the good thing by
Yeah, so
default.
not building more roads would do that, wouldn't it? I mean, you just got to make it really annoying to be on the road, to be
Well,
sitting
that's
in
the
your
flip
car
side,
and
right?
just
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Make it really bad to be in your car and really good to be. I mean,
Well, that was one of the
like
questions in our survey.
yeah.
Yeah,
Oh, was it
carry on.
okay? Yeah, I mean, just to have that the hardest thing to get across to people is how much better it will be the way we have to live. It's kind of hard to imagine, but because it always seems like something's been taken off you. But when people talk about going on holiday and what are you going to do? Oh, I'm going to get away from it all. They're going to go tramping or living in a
Yeah.
tent, or for me sailing or whatever. We want to go and do something that's a much simpler life and way less, usually way less energy intensive.
Slower. Yeah.
um, yeah, slower. All of the things. These are good things. They'll be good for us. This hyped up, high speed, kind of life is not. It's kind of addictive. But if we can break away
Well,
from
that
that,
has come
it's
through
so
a bit
much
in
nicer.
lockdown, hasn't it? There is a
Mm.
subset of people. It's kind of the unspeakable smugness of having an easy lockdown. That if you don't have small
Yes.
children or a stressful,
Yes. Yeah.
essential working job,
Yeah.
having the planet slowed down or the country slowed down is actually quite nice in a lot of ways.
Mm.
And a little
Yeah.
bit of what we're talking about is about that living more locally. I haven't used my car for a couple of weeks, and I usually do every now and then, but just haven't had to. It's funny when you said about the new world, because there is a new world 4 kilometres from me that I drive to because it's nice. It's got all the nice imported food.
Yeah. I know. But
um,
but if you
uh,
could get nice, fresh, local food, then it would be just
yeah,
as nice. It's not some ratty old stuff
oh, I'll
that's
be
been
better.
sitting in the
Yeah, yeah,
supermarket for a week and all that kind of thing. It would actually be really nice
exactly.
stuff.
I mean, and the farmers markets are, they're great, aren't they? And they're only expensive
That's the great
because, like you
example.
say, the true costs of the other thing, the true costs of the
Yeah.
supermarket food isn't included in the supermarket,
No.
price. Someone said, what do you think about e-bikes? Are they a better transition, or are they almost on the same continuum as electric cars that they're still made from fossil fuels and require batteries and mining? Um,
Yeah,
that's
but
that's
but
quite
I
a
mean
tricky
you
thing for.
well, yeah, but I mean those cargo bikes and stuff. At least you're not using most of your energy to shift a ton of steel around. You're shifting a
So it's
50,
that energy
20
return that's way
kgs
more
of steel
efficient.
around. Yeah. So it's way more efficient in
Yeah.
that way. And you can get a bit of exercise, while you're doing it. I mean, I kind of, I get them, and I prefer them to a car if they replace a car. But what I see around here is just every weekend we have, SUVs with racks on the back with battery bikes on them, and sometimes they're battery SUVs,
Yeah.
and they kind of go around on
Yeah.
these things, and
With
kid
a
themselves
halo
that
on
they're
top,
getting
right?
exercise. Yeah. I mean, it's like a
Yeah, I get hit. Yeah.
so yeah, it's a good thing, but we have to kind of, what's wrong with just
If they're
actually
replacing a ton of
providing
metal,
it,
great. If they're on the
Yes,
back of a ton of
yeah,
metal,
they're
then
adding
so
to
great.
it. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So if you've got rid of your
Yeah,
car
that
and
makes
replaced it with
sense.
an e-bike, then fantastic. Yeah.
Yeah. So we've got there's a statement. There's only 3 Western world countries that have the belief that they have the right to get into their car and drive anywhere and any time, and that's US, Australia, and New Zealand. Well, we have.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's partly because, as Mike says, that we've made it so easy to drive. Like we've made driving this first class, give it to you, hand it to you on a plate kind of system. We devote lots of our land to roads, and so people
Yeah.
have been made to believe that the easy option is drive. There's massive car parks everywhere you want to stop. So why wouldn't people drive? It's not that they're
built our cities and our suburbs around cars. We've
in
built
that
them,
way. Yeah.
yeah. So no wonder. Yeah. So we undo that
No
whole
wonder.
way we built.
Exactly. Yeah, I've talked a lot about suburban car parks, and if I want to walk to
Yeah.
my supermarket, I have to cross the sea of asphalt, and you feel like you're an alien walking 400 meters to a supermarket because half of that journey is crossing car park, and it's by design. It's not necessarily because people are inherently motorhead, driven necessarily. So what actions can we do in our space at the moment to actually make a difference without having to wait for a drastic event or government influence? Is there something beyond the kind of local grassroots action we talked about? Is there something that professional bodies can do as a collective, or working groups within a collective like ours? Should we be trying to tackle transport specific problems and processes, or should we be working with others, or are there lots of different things we could do?
Well, I think that what you're doing now and talking about it is a really good start, because lots of people and lots of organisations are not doing that. So yeah, I think that's the key to it, is the more you think about it. And I don't want to tell people how to live their lives or anything like that, but I think it's important that they understand the choices that they make and why, and so the individual choices can make a huge difference if all individuals do it, and it's what we eat and how we travel and how we live our lives and how much we consume is so much going to drive it. There's this thing about 70 companies or something like that make most of the emissions. Yeah, but the 70 companies would not exist if we didn't keep buying stuff off them, and so we can't kind of it has to be changed from top to bottom and all the way. It can't be just one will blame somebody else, which is what we love doing. It's
I think
that are the problem, that are doing 70% of the harm.
Yeah, it's like you can't blame McDonald's. Load your carbon credits onto them just because you had a cheeseburger. It's still your cheeseburger. So yeah, there's something in that about increasing awareness. One of the questions in our survey was, have you become more concerned about climate change in the last year? And 83% of our members said, yeah, I've become more concerned in recent years. And so hosting these conversations and talking with our workmates and colleagues about what we're doing at an organisation level, at a team level, helps to shift that kind of willingness to change, right? Like we wouldn't have had this conversation a few years ago. Not all of us were quite there already, but it feels like we're ready now. It feels like there is a tipping point in the professional understanding of the issue and the urgency to come together and do some good, whereas perhaps before we were all a bit shy or didn't really know how to answer someone who said, but an e-bike is just as bad. Or
Yeah, sorry, Bridget, it looks as though your connection dropped off there.
Yeah. We got bits of what you said.
Okay, well, Am I back now? Okay, cool. Well, that's right. I just went on a rant about how it's a bit of a tipping point zeitgeist and professional awareness of climate change, and so good timing to be having this conversation and to, talk amongst ourselves about what we can do together, as a group going forward. So we might wrap it up there in any case, but what we're going to do is to send out a summary of the conversation. Once we have the recording, we'll put that on the Transportation Group website with some of the links that Mike mentioned. And then I'm going to summarise the survey that we had out in our next issue of Roundabout, and as I said, in a couple of weeks. And then we're going to call for people who have energy and enthusiasm. If your surname is Keen, like Steve, then we'll come together and talk about what we might want to do at a sector level, whether that's work within our own tools and processes, working with other disciplines, lobbying, or local organisational action and case studies. We'll work together with the people who have the energy and enthusiasm to take this forward. So
thanks everyone for
we'll
coming
wrap it up
along,
there,
and thank you very
we'll be in
much,
touch with everybody,
Mike,
and
for
thank
your
you all
time
for coming.
today.
I'm not
It's
sure if you can
been
hear
really
me right now.
insightful
So
session.
maybe Rebecca, if you want to step
Thanks
in
everyone for coming,
and
and we will see you at the
wrap it up.
next chair's session. Thank you.
Great, thanks.